Hey everyone, how are you? Since Angular version 16, we have seen a slurry of new changes in Angular, especially related to Angular signals. So we have heard about a signal, and then we have heard about a computed, and then we also heard about a resource recently, and we also heard about an input signal. Then there was a linked signal, and then there are effects. So all of these primitives basically sometimes confuse us, and I have a hard time in figuring out where to exactly use all of them. So in this crash course, I'm going to actually show you how to actually combine all of these primitives that the Angular team has introduced in recent years to actually create a real functioning CRUD application. And as you know, a CRUD application is create, read, update, delete application, which is the basis of almost all basic web applications. Okay. So what is this CRUD application? It is a contacts application that we are going to build in this tutorial. You can see that we have a list of contacts here. We're using Angular material for the component library here. We can add a new contact like this. So let me say that I add my own contact here like this, give a phone here, and I save this. And there's a nice loader which tells us when it is loading. And you can see that my contact has been added here. I can also edit a new contact. So this is the edit functionality. I can say Zoeb Ahmed here maybe, and then I can save again. And you can see that all of the data saved correctly. And then I can also delete the contact if I don't need it. So I can click on delete here and it's going to promptly delete and update the list here. So this little app is actually powered completely by Signal. So we're using Signal primitives everywhere. There's no RxJS or any other reactive patterns that we used to use in Angular previously. So this is a basic application. I wanted to keep it really simple so that we can know about a very basic application. We can build upon that in our real applications. If you are looking for a more complicated or more complex real application, you might want to check out my Angular material dashboard, which has been built with signals from the ground up. And it has a nice little dashboard here and lots of other features, which you will find the link in the description. You can check that out if you are interested. Okay, so let's start with our basic question, and that is why signals? So signals were introduced in way back in version 16, and the reason was that Angular traditionally uses for change detection or for synchronizing the UI and the code zone.js. Zone.js is a third-party library which actually tells Angular when something has changed, and then Angular runs the whole top to bottom change detection process, which can get quite expensive sometimes. Okay. Now, in most applications, it works fine, and it has worked fine up till now. But for high performance applications or very large applications, you can see some effects when the change detection process actually runs every time on each small change. So Angular needed a way to have fine-grained reactivity built into the Angular system. Okay. So signals is exactly that fine-grained reactivity, and this promises to bring in great performance improvements in the future. Now, in the future, once signals will be used more frequently and more extensively in Angular, eventually Angular is going to do away with zone.js, and there's already an experimental mode currently which you can utilize if you want to remove zone.js completely. Okay, so let's just start with what is a signal next. So what is a signal? Now, a signal is basically just a wrapper around a value. So that's a simple definition of a signal. Now that value can be actually anything. It can be any type. It can be a primitive type, a string number, or it can also be your own custom object type. Now in our case, since we're building a contacts application, is going to be a contact interface. Okay, so how do you declare a signal in your code? So you use signal from Angular core and you just call this function. The first part of that will be the type. You can give the type here, and then there will be an initial value here that is necessary for a signal. Okay. How do you read a signal? Well, you can just call it like a function. Now, because signal is a wrapper on a value, you can't use it directly. You need to unpack it. You can consider the signal as a box, and you need to open that box to actually get its value. So you could do that by using the parenthesis to access its value. The third part is that how do you change the signal? So you change the signal by just calling the set method of the signal and giving the new value. Now, whenever the signal changes using this set, Angular knows where the consumer of the signal are in its template, so it's going to directly change only those parts. And that is actually the fine-grained reactivity which signals promise to bring. Okay, I don't know about you, but I am a bit tired of theory now. So let's start with the practical implementation of our CRUD application. And as we come to need the different primitives during the course of the app, I'm going to introduce it bit by bit so that you can get us some theory, so you can get practical implementation right after that. Okay. So let me just give you an overview of my project here. So my project is basically an Angular 19 project that I've already scaffolded. Now, if you need more information about that, you can check my modern Angular 19 crash course, which I did recently. It would be linked in the description and also in the card above, which actually gives you all the basics to start a new application and what are the settings that I use to start my new application. So we have an Angular 19 application here, which is the latest version, and then we have Angular material added to the application here as well for our component library. And as for our basic setup, we have our config and we have our routing setup here. So we have a routes file, which we'll need for the different pages of our or different routes of our application. It's empty right now, so we're going to add it as we do it. And then we have our basic component, which is a root component, the app component. And here we have just a main toolbar that we have set up along with some design token overrides so that I can have the primary color over on this toolbar, just like it was in the previous material versions. In the current versions, we get a grayish toolbar, and I prefer this one. Okay. So all of this code, the final code will be on my GitHub link for free in the description. So don't worry about any of the code. You can check out all of this code later. All right, so let's first start with our basic contacts list, which is the first thing that we need to do. So for that, we need to create a component which is going to show that contacts list. So we're going to go in our terminal here, a new terminal, and we're going to do ngg component. And in our components folder, I'm going to create contacts list. Great, I have my component here. Okay, so now let's add it to the router. So we're going to go in app.routes and we're going to do path contacts list component and path match full. And it's going to guide me to adding the components contacts list component here. And this is all that we need at this point. In fact, let's just split the screen a bit so that we can actually see our application here. So you can see now that our contact list is shown here correctly. That means that this is working. Okay. So now the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually add our contact interface so that it represents our data. And we know what the structure will be. So we're going to go in our model folder here and we're going to add a new file here. We're going to call this contacts.ts or contact.ts in fact. And let's define an interface here called contact. And it's going to have ID. Then of course it will have a name, an email and a phone, not the address, city, state. We don't need it at this point. So we are going to have these four things just to make it simple. And then in our app.component, and then we're going to go in our contacts list and we are going to define our first signal. So how do we do that? So let's say that we define it with some dummy values at this point. So we're going to do contacts is equals to signal, and you can see it's imported from Angular core, and the type for this will be contact. Let's import it. And then it will be an array of, and you can see that it gives a suggestion of an empty array. Now let's add some dummy values here that I already have so that we can see exactly how this looks like. So let's say that we have these set of values here and we can give an initial value of this here. Okay, you can see the ID is giving an issue because we need to have it as a number, and it means that the types are working correctly. Okay, let's say display here using the for loop for contact of contacts, and we're going to track it by the contact.id. And then in the div, we can have these three things here just as a simple test. And you can see we have our data listening from the contacts here directly. Okay, all of our data. Great. So you can see the value of the signal is being accessed through the use of these parentheses as I explained previously. Okay, so let's tidy this up a bit and use an actual Angular material list. So I'm going to, in our for, outside this for, I'm going to do a mat list. Okay, and here as well. And then I'm going to import the matlist module here. It's giving me a suggestion here. And it's also going to allow me to import it from here. So you can import matlist module from Angular material list. And then in this material list, we can then refactor this according to our list. So I'm going to call this a matlist item for each of this. And then within this, the first one is going to be matlist item title. So now these are some directives provided by the Angular material list so that we can style our various items in different ways. Okay, so we're not going to show the phone. I think we can remove the phone for now. And for the matlist item line, we can actually we actually show the email here. Okay, so let's save this. And now you can see we have our nice looking list in a flash. Okay, derived from signals. All right, great. So this was our first ever signal. Okay, but what's the fun really in just using some static data here like this, hard-coded data like this? We need to actually get the data from an API, which you would do in a real application. So in order to simulate that, because it's a bit difficult to set up an API on the server side and requires a lot of different steps, I have set up my own API service in my Angular application here, and let me show you that. So it basically has all of the functionality here along with a simulated delay of 1 second so that we can simulate a network call and we can show all of our nice loaders as well just to test it out. And it has get contacts, it has add, delete, update contact, and all of the contact functions that we will need for our CRUD application. So we are going to use the API service in place of a real API. Okay, so how do we actually use the API service or any other asynchronous resource? To do that, we will need to go back to what is a resource in the signals world. Okay, so what is a resource? Now, a resource is asynchronous data fetching, in other words. Okay, so it allows asynchronous data fetching in our signal based application. All right, so the syntax for that is very basic, and you have a resource as a function, and then within that, you give some config parameters. They're basically just two things that we can give. The first is a request, and the second is a loader. Now, this loader is basically the mandatory thing because it tells the resource how to get the data. So it gives a function. This function needs to be a promise, okay, so that the loader knows how to actually load this resource, okay. This request is basically some parameters that you want to send to the loader. For example, you have your ID that you want to fetch the data for, or you have some other query parameter that you want to send to the API call. Okay, and the great thing about the resource is that it encapsulates all of the things, the state changes that you would need for an asynchronous resource. So if you have a network call, you would need the value of that resource when it actually completes its operation, okay, fetches it asynchronously. Then you might also need the loading state when it's actually loading the value, when it's not completed loading, okay. And the third thing is that you would also need the error in case that there was an error in the asynchronous fetching process, okay. So all of these three things are basically covered, and there are also other properties as well, which we might talk in some other tutorial in the future. But these three things are the basics that we can use to get started with a resource, okay. Great. So let's add a resource to our contacts app now. Okay, so we have a static signal here. Let's remove this. And instead of this, we are going to do contacts resource here. Okay. And as I said, really simple. We're going to import it from Angular core. And then this resource is going to have, we don't need the request at this point because we need to fetch the list without any parameter sent to it. So we're just going to specify the loader here. And the loader is going to be a function. It's going to return API service. Now, API service has not been injected here. So we are going to do API service and inject API service. Okay. It's going to import all of the things for me. And this is the nice thing about AI coding, AI based coding nowadays. If you haven't tried it yet, do try it. It's going to make your life a lot easier. Okay. So we get the contacts here. Okay. What changes do we need to do on the template then? So for the contacts resource, instead of the contact signal that we can get the contact resource dot value. And notice this value is also a signal. So we need to access it using the thesis. Okay. So this should work. Let's try this out. And now you can see after a 1 second delay, because it's an API call, you'll see that you get all of the same data as you were getting from our static data. Great. But being dynamic, we can actually change this data through our API service. Okay, so our list is now fetched from the API. Let's add a simple progress indicator because this part where initially 1 second is actually a bit jarring for the user because the user actually does not know what is happening. So a best practice obviously is to have a loader of some sort. In our case, I'm just going to add a material spinner loader to show you how to actually do that. So really simple. I'm just going to do mat progress spinner. Okay. And let's import this here as well. Mat progress spinner module. And I'm going to also import it here. So I'm going to do mat progress spinner module from the Angular material this. And then I'm going to do here mode as indeterminate. All right. And then I'm only going to show this when the contacts resource dot not loading but is loading signal is set. Okay. We don't want to show it when we have actually got the value. Okay. All right. So when we save this, what happens? We get this nice big loader when we are actually loading the contacts resource. Great. And in order to style it properly in the middle, what I've done actually is I've just added some basic styles to the styles.satisfied, and I have given it an absolute position and a center position so that our loader is always in the center. Okay, great. So you can see nice and simple the contacts. The resource API basically encapsulates a lot of different things that we would need when we actually want to fetch some data. Okay, so we have our live contacts list working, connected with the API service. Let's add the delete function first of all, because that is the simplest and we can do it on the contact list itself. So first let's add the button for this. So we are going to add a button in the mat list item here. Or in fact, let's add a div here and let's call this div the mat list item meta. Now the meta is the UI components that you want to add to the end of this list on the right side here. So Angular Material actually handles all of the formatting for that itself, so we don't have to do it. Let's declare a mat icon button and it's going to be a delete button. We need to import our mat icon module and mat button module here so that it all works perfectly. Okay, let's import these things here. Great, so we have a nice little delete button for each of our contacts items. Okay, let's add an event handler here, delete contact, and then we can just simply give contact.id here. Okay, let's add this here, delete ID string. Okay, so in delete contact, the first thing we need to do is we need to do API service dot delete contact here. Okay, and let's give in the ID here. And you'll notice that delete contact is basically a promise. So we actually want to also use the await here. Okay, now once it is deleted, we also want to reload the resource again. And there's a nice little reload function for any resource that you have so that it can reload the contacts here. Okay, so this is really typical of a CRUD application if you have worked with them before. And now you can see that once we click on delete, it refreshes, and once you click on delete again, you'll see this also disappears. So your list is updating according to that. One thing you'll notice is that there's a bit of a delay between deleting and showing the loader. That is because we only show the contacts resource loading, which is handled here. We don't show the deleting loading. So how do we show the deleting loading? We actually need to add a new signal for that. Okay, so let's add a signal here. Let's call this deleting and let's make it false initially. Now we don't need to give the type explicitly all of the time for a signal. If you give an initial value, the signal is going to automatically derive the type from it. Okay, so deleting signal is going to be false, and then we are going to do this dot deleting set true, and after we have deleted, we do this dot deleting dot set false. Okay, and now we have a problem where we need to combine these two states, and for that we'll need to understand the concept of computed. Okay, so what is a computed? Now a computed is basically a derived signal, and it is a read-only derived signal. So its value is completely derived from another signal. We can't really change it explicitly ourselves. Okay, so this syntax for that is basically just a function in which your dependent signal needs to be using the value. Okay, so in my case, you can see that we have my computed and this dot my signal, which was our original signal. Notice that we are using the value and then we append something or change it or modify it to give a new value in my computer. Okay, and how do we access it? Well, we can access it in the same way because it is also a signal, even though it is just read only. So it gives hello there here. Now this all happens automatically. So Angular basically finds out what are the dependencies of my computed automatically when you actually specify the signal within this function. Okay, so then Angular knows exactly when to update the my computed when the my signal updates. Okay, this my computed only changes when the my signal changes. Okay, otherwise it retains its old value, so it does not recompute again and again when the UI is rendering. Great. So how do we use it in the context of our problem here? Okay, so we have two states. We have a deleting state and then we have a contacts resource.is loading state. Okay, so let's create a loading computed here. So let's call this loading computed, and then this would be a function. Of course, let's first import this computed here from Angular core, and then this is going to have this dot contacts dot resource dot is loading or this dot deleting. So whenever any of these signals change their values, this is going to get updated itself. Okay, and now we can replace this contract resource dot loading with loading here. Great. Let's test this out. And now when we click on delete here, we can immediately see the loader happening. Okay, So both of the loaders are combined into one by using the power of computers, a derived signal. And since we're talking about signals, I have built this dashboard, this customizable dashboard from the ground up by using signals. It uses the latest Angular 19 and it uses even the NGRX signal store, which is the recommended way to handle state in your Angular application in a signals world. The special thing about this is that you can actually have a dashboard which is customizable like this. So you can drag and drop it here and the layout is going to adjust itself. By the way, this is using the View Transitions API, which is a really cutting edge way to animate layouts in CSS. So we can also remove our widgets here like this, and we can also resize our widgets like this. Okay, so all of this state management and all of this interactivity is brought to you by Signals from the ground up. So this is a nice showcase of what Signals are actually capable of. And of course, this dashboard has all of the latest features that you would expect from any dashboard. So you have a dark mode and it has material components, Angular material linked in, and then it has Tailwind CSS integrated as well. And lastly, it also has Firebase authentication integrated into it so that you can integrate it with a serverless backend quickly. So if you are on the lookout for a starter template which uses signals and which uses the latest Angular versions, be sure to check this out. The link is in the description and you can try out the demo there as well. Now let's get back to the video. Okay, so our contacts list is done. Now we need to add the next thing, and that is adding a new contact. So how do we do that? Well, let's create another component here. Let's do ngg, and this time I'm going to use just C, which means component. And in our components folder, I'm going to do add contact. Okay, so let's add a root for this, and we're going to add a root here. The path will be add, and the component is going to be the add contact component. It's going to import it directly from the top. And then let's go back to my app.component so that we can add a button here to route to this actually. Okay, so in the mat toolbar, I'm going to add an A, but this is going to be a mat icon button. Okay, the router link is going to this. Now for router link, we need to also add the router link directive here. Okay, and we also obviously need to add a mat icon module and a mat button module to render all of these things correctly. Okay, and we have a mat icon add circle that we're using here. Okay, let's save this, and you can see we have a nice looking button. Let's click on this and you can see that it goes to the add screen and nothing is there basically at this point. All right, so let's build up our add contact. So now our add contact is going to have a contact form here. First of all, let's do an h2 here, and we're going to say add contact here. Okay, then we're going to add a form here, and this form is going to use mat form field. So we have a name here. Let's also import mat form field module here and the mat input module here. Okay, and then let's have another form field here. Okay, and let's have another form field here. So for an email and for the phone. Okay, let's add a class here to actually style this a bit. So let's say fields here. Let's add a class here and let's style these fields a bit. Let's make this a grid and let's make this grid template columns as repeat to 1fr. Okay, so we're going to make just 2 columns of this grid. Okay, let's also add a bit of gap here. So we're going to a gap of 8 pixels here, and in fact we can also add some padding here to our host so that we have, okay, so let's give it a 16 pixels padding and 16 pixels gap here as well. Okay, so this form looks nice now. Okay, so we have 3 fields here, and then we'll also have some buttons here. So at the bottom of the form here, we also want to have some buttons. So we're going to have 2 buttons. So one button we want it to be a mat flat button, and this is going to be our save button. Okay, this will be our primary button, and let's also import our mat button module here so that we can, and then we'll also have the cancel here. Now this is going to be a raised button because it's styled a bit differently. Okay, let's see how this looks, and these actually are appearing somewhere else. So let's add another div for these fields here and a separate handling for that. So we're going to do, and let's just remove this form here. Okay, great. So we can also add an actions here maybe, and then I can style my actions and give it a bit of a gap, 16 pixels, something like this, and justify content will be start. Okay, so this looks reasonably well. Okay, so for the cancel, we actually just want to take it back. So we are going to just do router link and we are going to do router link back. Okay, so cancel is going to take us back to the list again. Okay, so we have our form set up visually. Now, how do we actually store the data for this form so that we can send it? So the simplest way in Angular is to use the template driven forms. And for the template driven forms, we have a forms module that we want to import here. Okay, now this provides us with an ng model here, directive, through which we can actually do our two-way data binding. Okay, that means that when the user types in something in the input box, is going to update that object, and then when that object is updated, for example, when we are going through the edit case, it's going to show that on the UI. So it's two-way data binding. Okay, so signal is perfect for that because a signal is writable and we can directly bind it to the ng model. So let's declare some three signals that we have to store our values. So we have name, which will be a signal, okay, email and phone. And let's import this signal from our this. And then we are just going to specify the signal itself. Now remember, now note that this is not the value of the name, but this is just the signal directly. Because if we take the value, it's just a single value. But if we send the signal, it's going to be a writable signal and the ng model is going to identify it as something in which we can save the value. And so make sure that this is not a value. Okay. Similarly, for the email, we are going to also do the same thing. And for the phone, I'm also going to do the same thing. Okay. And of course, it's template driven form. So it also requires us to have the name property here. Otherwise, it doesn't render correctly. So let's add a name property here as well. Let's save this again. And you can see our form works perfectly now. Okay. Let's test out whether we have these values correctly or not. So in our save, we are just going to console.log for the time being, just to see whether our signal values are appearing fine. So let's make this the type submit, but let's make this the type button. Okay. And then in the form ng submit handler, we can just call the save method. Okay. And let's see what we get here. So we can open up our developer console here. And then we can see what's this. So I can write my name, okay, and the phone number and click save. And you can now see that I have Zoeb at Gmail, and I have the values correctly being mapped to the signals. Okay, great. So let's go on and save these values. Well, we are going to inject our API service here. Great. Let's import this here as well. And then in the save, we are going to do this.a.add contact. And then we are going to do this. But for the name, we get the name, email, and the phone, the current value. And then it's going to save this. Of course, it is async. So we also need to add a wait here. Okay, so this save works. But once we save this, we also need to do another thing. But once we save this, okay, so let's test this out. And let's say we add our new name here and phone here. And we save this. Okay, something happened, but we didn't know it. So first of all, we want to add our loading state here. So we're going to add a signal here to store our loading state. And we're going to do this.saving.set is true, this.saving.set is false. And also, once it's done, we also want to navigate back to the contacts list to see the new contact. Okay, so we're going to add this.router to navigate back to this. So let's also inject our router here. Great. So let's save this out and test the whole flow again. So we're going to do zoeb@gmail.com and let's add the phone. Let's save. And you can see this. Okay. So you can now see that our new contact has been added here. But you notice that we did not see the loading progress spinner. So we need to bind this to our mat progress spinner here. We need to add a mat progress. We need to do if saving mat spinner mode indeterminate as before, and we need to import it here. Okay. Let's import it here as well. Great. So let's test this out just once more to see whether it works fine. And let's do zoeb@gmail.com again, and then the phone here. Save, and we have our nice loader, and we have a nice loader as well. And as soon as it goes back, it's going to, since we are creating the contacts resource within the component itself, it's going to initialize the component, it's going to refetch everything. So we don't actually need to refetch it ourselves manually after adding something. Okay. So our add contact works like this. Okay. So we have our add contact done, we have our contacts list, we have our delete done. So the only thing left now is the edit functionality. And that is the most complicated part of this app, because the edit flow requires multiple steps and it also requires multiple signal primitives for us to get it to work correctly. Okay, so let's get started. Now, so first of all, we need to, as before, create a new component, and we're going to do it in components. Let's call this edit contact. Okay. And then let's add the root for it as before. So let's add the root for it. Okay. And it's giving me a nice suggestion here. So the path is edit, and then you have a parameter, because for an edit flow, you actually need to know which of the contact we are actually editing. Okay. So it needs an ID parameter, and then it imports the edit contact here. Fine. Okay. Now, how do we get this ID parameter inside of the component? Well, for that, there's a new feature that was introduced way back, I think in version 16, I think, in which we need to go in our app.config and we need to specify with component input binding. What this does is that Angular gives you the ID that is being specified in the root for that component inside of the component as an input, so that you can directly use it without using activated route or any of the other ways that we traditionally used to do in Angular. Okay, let's add the button as well here, the edit button, so that we can complete this flow here. So let's go to our contacts list. In our contacts list, we're also going to, besides or before the delete button, we're going to add an edit button here. Okay, and this router link, we don't have a router link here, so we need to have a router link here. Let's import this from there, and here we need to do edit, and then we need to send the contact ID. Great. Let's save this, and you can see we have a nice edit button here. So when we click on it, you can see that we can go to the edit contact, and if you look at the route here, you can see that edit one, this is the ID of the contact that we are editing. If you go back and we select this one, for example, you can see that it has a different ID. Great. So let's now build up our edit contact. Okay, so you can see that it's giving me some suggestion about defining an input as the ID, and we can get the input, but for that you first need to know a bit about the input signal, which is the signal equivalent to the input. Okay, so what is an input signal? Well, an input signal is a signal-based reactive input, which means that whenever the component's input is going to change from the outside, whenever the parent sends in a new input to the component, is going to propagate a change in the signal. So if you are using the signal for some other work, it's going to automatically get those changes without us needing ng on changes. So the basic syntax is really simple. There are no decorators involved in this. You just have my input, and then you have an input like this. You specify the type here, and you give the initial or the default value when there is no input. Okay. Now once you have this input, you can now plug in the my input wherever you want in a signal based flow, and there's no need for the ng on changes hook, which we use for finding out when the input has changed in a component. Okay, great. So in our case, what we're going to do is we're just going to write ID, and this is going to be an input. Let's import this first. It's going to be a string. Great. So the first thing we need to do after getting the ID is to actually fetch the specific contact. So how do we fetch the contact? We can use the same concept of a resource, but this time we can use the request along with it, because we need to get a specific contact. Okay, so let's define a contact resource here, just like before. Okay, now in this resource, but the difference is that we would need to have a request as well. Now this request is basically just be a signal, and whenever this signal passed to it this changes, the contact resource is going to use the loader to fetch it again. Okay, so it is completely reactive. So in our case, because we just need to send the ID to get the specific ID, we can just pass in the this.id signal directly, not the value, just the signal. But if, for example, you need to send multiple values, you can actually send a computed instead of that. So we're just going to also define the loader here. Now in this loader, we are going to get the request, and this request is basically your ID here. Okay, and then we're just going to use this.api service or get contact function. Let's inject the API service here. Let's import this as well. Okay, and we are all done. We have the contact resource, and it's going to change whenever our input changes. Okay, so let's test this out, and let's just contact resource.value here and see whether we can value. And let's say we do the name here just to test it out. So let's save this, and now you can see that it loads our contact after 1 second, and then it shows this. Okay, of course you need the loading indicator. We're going to add that in a bit, but first let's build up our form so that we can actually show our existing this on a form so the user can edit it. Okay, so for the form, we need to just copy paste the same form that we have in add contact so that we don't do these things again and again. Of course, we can also make it reusable. If you look at the final code, I have converted into a reusable form component so that we can keep it in one place, because forms usually they are similar for add and contact, and it's makes your maintenance really easy in the future. Okay, So instead of add contact, we're going to make this edit contact. And then for the mat form field, we are going to import all of our things that we need here. Okay. So let's define name, signal, email, and phone like this and import the signal here. Okay. So all of this should work fine. In the save, we can also create a function here to save this like this. Okay. Of course, we also need to add some styling. So let's copy the styles here as well. Okay. So the form looks good, but the first thing we need to do, we have got the contact resource here. The contact resource is being fetched as we tested it just now, but we actually want to pre-fill the fields with that data so that the user can edit it, as is common in an edit flow. So we actually need to change these signals to actually have the value of the contact resource. The problem is we'll have the resource dot value, that is a signal as well, and then we have these signals separately in our fields here so that we can store the values. How do we link them? Well, for that we'll have to go to the concept of a linked signal. Okay, so what is a linked signal then? Well, a linked signal is basically a writable signal which is dependent on another signal. So you can see it as a combination of a computed and a normal signal. Okay, so you define it by using this linked signal from Angular core, and then you can specify a function which can define some dependencies here. All right. So this signal is basically the default value or the linked value of this my signal. Initially, when it is declared, this signal is going to get the value of this. But then you can also change this later. Okay. So let's use it in our form fields because this is perfect for that purpose. Okay. So instead of a signal, let's make this as linked signal. So we're going to do linked signal, and this is going to take the this.value.name. Okay. Similarly for the email and similarly for the phone. So this means that it's going to set the values of these fields from that contact that we got from the contact resource. Okay. So let's save this and see whether our fields are getting pre-populated. And now you can see that our fields are getting pre-populated with the initial data. And if we change this, because we are using ng model and because it is a writable signal, a linked signal is a writable signal, we can also change it ourselves. So if, for example, we do save here and we just do console.log all of the three values, let's do Emma Brown Jr. here. And if you're going to test it out in your console, you're going to be able to see that it updates this signal to Emma Brown Jr. and the other signals are with the default values. Great. So this is exactly how we want our forms to be. So this is your second step that you want in your edit functionality. The third and the last step is when you want to actually save this. Well, as we did before, we are going to do async and we're going to do await this.api service or update contact. We already have the ID here, or in fact, we need to send this ID inside of this object here. So we can do ID this.id. And in fact, it's saying that it can get an undefined value. So what we're going to do is we are going to, if it's undefined, we are going to give a default value of empty string as well. Okay. Now it's also giving an issue with this.id. So let's make it required here. Okay. Great. So this should save our contact. And then we need to go back to our original contacts list. So let's import the router here as well. So let's do inject and router. Okay. Great. And the last thing, of course, is to actually combine the loading states, and we are going to use a saving loading state here, saving signal false, and then we're going to give the saving state here true, and then we can do saving set false, and then we can add a loading which basically combines both of them. So we're going to do this.contact resource.loading, is loading in fact, or saving. So whenever any of these changes, the loading is going to get updated. And let's add a loader here as well. So we're going to add if loading mat progress spinner mode indeterminate. Let's import this here and here. Great. Let's save this. And now you can see when you fetched it, there was a loading indicator telling us that, okay, something is being fetched. And once you change this and once you save this, you also get a nice loader again. It goes back and you can now see that Emma Brown Jr. is here. You can edit it again to actually change it further and our whole flow works. Okay, so we have completed the functionality of our application pretty nicely now, and our application has all of the features that it needs, but we just need one more concept to actually sort of make this crash course comprehensive, and that is the concept of an effect. So what is an effect basically? Now, effect was introduced way back in version 16 as well, along with the signal and the computed. An effect basically is when we want to do something when a signal changes. Okay. So computed is a derived value of a signal, and linked signal is also derived. And resource is also derived from a signal, but effect is when you actually want to trigger something when a signal changes. Okay, so how do you define effect? So you give an effect function which you can specify in your constructor, or you can also specify as a part of your as variable in your component. And basically you can specify a signal which you want to track, and then you can just do anything when that signal is changed and use its value. Now effect runs at least once for every signal that is dependent, and again as with computed, this effect is only going to run when the signal changes. It's not going to run on every signal, only on this signal that is being tracked here. So Angular tracks this automatically, okay? Now this is to be used very rarely, if at all, because this is just meant to be used for things like logging or things like storing to local storage, maybe to sync it up with local storage, or maybe to update the DOM somehow when you actually can't use the computed or any other derived state for your purposes. So this should not be used for business use cases. This is especially not be used for updating signals, because then you might run into loops, infinite cycles. Okay. So, but rarely when you want to use it, there are some safeguards. And if you want more information about this, check out my playlist on signals, which has some videos on effects and how you can actually use them safely. Okay. But what do we do in our application? How we can use effects in our application? As you can see, the main functionality is already done, so we actually didn't need that. But there's one thing that I didn't want it. So I wanted to also add an error notification when an error happens. Let's simulate an error here. For example, you have your get contacts function. Let's throw a new error here, and I already have it in fetching the contacts, which can happen in a real world application. So one way to be actually, we can show this in the contacts list here, somewhere here. So you can see if the contacts resource dot we can show the error here, contacts resource dot error. Okay, and you can see that now we are getting the error fetching contacts. Let's refresh this again, and you can see that we are getting error fetching contacts. But oftentimes in some libraries, for example in Angular material, you have the snack bar, which cannot be triggered from the template. It needs to be triggered from the code. So in that case, you can use an effect for that purpose. So let's use an effect to actually show our error using a snack bar. So let's create an effect here. So we are going to do show error as a class variable here. We're going to use effect imported from Angular core, and then we're going to specify the effect here. We're going to get the error here, this dot contacts resource dot error, and then obviously we don't want to show it when there is no error, so we are only going to show it when there is an error. And when there is an error, we want to use the mat snack bar. So let's also inject the snack bar here, inject mat snack bar here. Let's import this from the top here. Okay. And here then we can use this .snackbar.open error.message. We can give a duration here. We have it as a normal error. So we're going to cast it as an error, and then we can use the error message here. And then let's try this out and see how this looks. And now you can see there's a loader, and then we have an error fetching contacts here, and then it sort of goes away. You can actually remove the duration here, because for errors they should be persistent. So you can see that we have error fetching contacts when we have an error, and when we don't have an error, like if we remove this, you can see that we have our application working normally. This is the concept of effects, which should be used relatively rarely when you actually need it, and it should not involve changing other signals, because that is an anti-pattern. Okay, and that brings us an end to our Angular Signals crash course, and I hope you learned a ton about Angular Signals and how it comes together in your app. Now be sure that some of these primitives like the resource and the linked signal are developer preview, or they are in experimental stage, so they might not be ready to be used in production right away, but you can use it for new applications so that you can future-proof your application. And if you'd like to know more about signals, about different concepts in depth, I discuss them a lot on my channel, and you can check out the playlist that I'm linking to, which actually contains a lot of my signal-related videos. So if you want to know more about effects in detail, input signals, I have a lot of things for you. So thanks for watching, and I hope you liked this video. Be sure to subscribe the channel and share it with your friends so that others can also benefit from this. I'll see you next time with some more interesting stuff related to Angular.